Up next, a car crash baffles investigators.
At first it was like, oh, a sad, tragic accident.
No one can determine exactly what killed the victim.
And it wasn't something that was a normal death.
Detectives and doctors try to find a cause.
There were no internal injuries.
It's not an accident. It's not medical. What else can it be?
On a frigid afternoon in February of 2005, police in Highland Heights, near Cleveland, Ohio, got an unusual call. A woman was behind the wheel of a car that was drifting along in a residential neighborhood, moving slowly, but still out of control.
She's driving through a school zone. Witnesses advised us that she slumped over the wheel. The car drifted left to center, sideswiped the other vehicle, then drifted back into her lanes. It was traveling so slowly that one of the witnesses was able to open the door and actually stop the car physically.
The driver, who appeared to be in her 30s, was semi-conscious and having trouble breathing.
When the paramedics arrived, they were confused because there were no physical injuries on her body. There was no outward appearance or obvious cause of why she was in this state.
The driver had an open cell phone beside her and had apparently been trying to call for help. She was rushed to the emergency room, where she died a short time later. The victim was identified as Rosie Isa, the 38-year-old mother of 2 young children.
What is this?
She was married to an emergency room doctor who worked down in Akron. His name was Yazid Isa. Everybody that I talked to said classically sweet, kind, giving mom, all the things that we think would be salt of the earth. Great person.
Her husband Yazid, whom everyone called Yaz, told his fellow doctors and police that Rosie had no serious medical issues, certainly nothing that would cause her death.
He couldn't offer any information as to why she died.
And an autopsy offered no answers as to what had happened.
She did not have any natural disease either that would cause her death.
The subsequent toxicology scan also provided no clues about what killed her. Doctors and police were baffled. Rosie had no injuries, no diseases. She wasn't using drugs, and there was no sign of her encountering any toxic substances, even accidentally. Yet she was dead from a fender bender that wasn't fast enough to cause any serious injuries.
It became, in my tenure as a reporter, one of the strangest cases I've ever seen in terms of what looked from all appearances, that a tragic death of a woman, a mother, 2 small kids, high-profile couple, doctor, husband, and then all of a sudden, oh my goodness.
Police and doctors wanted answers, and fast. Rosie's initial toxicology scan showed no illicit drugs in her system.
There was nothing obvious at this stage of the autopsy to say why she died. So the cause of death was deferred pending further examination.
A second, more extensive test also came up empty.
There's always testing that can be performed, almost limitless, but the sample is limited. The coroner informed the police department that they had exhausted all of their testing possibilities.
That meant investigators had to narrow it down to 1 or 2 possibilities before they could do another test. This stalled the investigation until detectives discovered a phone call Rosie made just before her death. A phone call that told analysts what to test for. Just before the low-speed crash that sent Rosie Issa to the hospital, she made a phone call to a friend on her cell phone.
She was on the cell phone with one of her buddies, Ava McGregor, and she mentioned to Ava, I feel like crap because I took this calcium pill. God, I feel like just, ugh.
Before her death, Rosie was preparing for a bright future. She and her husband, Yazid, were planning to have another baby. Yazid, a doctor, was giving her supplements.
There were 3 or 4 different prenatal vitamins that he was supplying to her, one of which was calcium supplements.
As far as detectives and doctors knew, taking the calcium and prenatal medications were the only changes from Rosie's normal routine. Was it possible these supplements could have caused her death? Her husband said that was impossible.
According to Yaz, her death was a mystery medically to him as it was to everyone else. When I asked Yazid about the calcium supplements and the prenatal vitamins, did you think they would have any cause for her death? And he said, no, calcium won't hurt you.
But what if it wasn't calcium Rosie had taken? Could this be a case of product tampering? The idea wasn't far-fetched. Something similar had happened before in Chicago in 1982.
Our top story, authorities in Chicago have officially confirmed the death of a 7th victim from Tylenol capsules laced with deadly cyanide.
This was one of the first cases of its kind anywhere in the world. Someone, to this day, there's been no arrest, laced over-the-counter Tylenol with cyanide.
They also report finding for the first time contaminated capsules in an unsold bottle of Tylenol removed from a store shelf at a major suburban shopping center.
It came to be known as the Tylenol murders, and it forever changed the way over-the-counter medicines and even some food products are sold. If this was a repeat of the Tylenol murders, if Rosie's calcium pills had been tampered with, there was a very real possibility that the public at large could be in danger.
So you have to continue on and make further investigation. Keep in mind, this is not homicide, but unexplained death. You have to include all possibilities.
Meanwhile, police were getting some interesting information that might offer another explanation for what happened to Rosie. It turned out that the Issa marriage was not quite as happy as it seemed.
Yazid Issa had several extramarital affairs since he and Rosie had been married. As a matter of fact, the extramarital activity never stopped once they were married.
These are signals that the representation or the outward appearance of this loving, happy marriage were starting to be questioned significantly.
The key evidence appeared to be Rosie's calcium pills, and no one knew where they were, or even whether they'd been destroyed.
The detective then says, well, let's go get those pills. Calls Yaz and says, Doctor, we would like to go get those pills. He goes, absolutely, no problem. So they rush to the house, and the calcium pills are still there. They hadn't been flushed down the toilet. The bottle was still there. They bag and tag them, send them down to be analyzed.
But that analysis took a few days. And in the meantime, something happened that took an unexplained death in Cleveland and launched it into an international investigation.
It got even stranger. I mean, I just kept going, how does this get any weirder? And it did. It was extraordinary.
The key to the unexplained death of Rosie Issa seemed to lie in the calcium pills she'd taken just a short time before she died. Rosie's husband, Dr. Yazid Issa, known as Yaz, freely provided those pills to the police. The pills were sent to Dr. Douglas Rohde, a forensic toxicologist. Immediately, he saw something amiss. 9 pills in the bottle didn't look like the others.
The 9 that looked different had a crystalline appearance to them, and the remaining capsules that were in that bottle looked powdery and had some pink tinge to them.
Both sets of pills were subjected to a process called Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, or FTIR.
The FTIR test is a test that will allow me to look at the molecular structure of a molecule using infrared radiation, and the bonds of the molecule will vibrate, releasing an energy, and that energy pattern is what I use to identify what the substance is.
The amount of energy a substance can absorb is unique to that substance, and the resulting vibrations can be measured by a spectrometer. That's then checked against a library of known substances. Most of the pills in Rosie's bottle were calcium, but the 9 that looked different were not.
The vibrational pattern of the unknown crystalline material matched the vibrational pattern of cyanide.
To make absolutely sure, analysts turned to a confirmatory test. It's called the Prussian blue test, and for a very good reason.
The active ingredient in the Prussian blue test is ferric ferrocyanide, which will react rapidly with the cyanide molecule to elicit a blue color.
Which is exactly what happened.
I was shocked to see that this was cyanide, and I was alone in the lab and exclaimed to myself, wow.
I had my smoking gun.
As these tests were being conducted, investigators and Rosie's family got some stunning news.
Dr. Issa apparently decided that he was going to leave the country.
If you have seen Dr. Yazid Issa and know his location, tonight authorities would like you to call.
Where is Yazid? Wow. And from there, it really went crazy.
Dr. Issa had money and family connections in the Middle East. Investigators brought in the vast resources of the FBI to help track him down.
You can't let people get away with killing their wives and mothers of their children and just go to another country and they're safe.
The FBI soon located Dr. Issa in Beirut, Lebanon, a place that offered a layer of protection for a man on the run.
The problem with Lebanon was that there was no solid extradition treaty where an individual could be returned from Lebanon to the United States.
I thought, well then, he may have committed the perfect crime in that we can't get him and there's no way to go over and pull him back. So this story is almost over then. I mean, how horrible.
Dr. Issa insisted that he didn't kill his wife and also insisted that fleeing the country was no admission of guilt.
He said that I only left because I could not get a fair trial here.
In Beirut, Dr. Issa was being watched by FBI agents and local informants, and he certainly didn't seem to be a grieving widower who missed his children.
He was the playboy of Beirut because he had plenty of money. His brother had a very successful business that he was partners with. He's having a great old time.
In fact, to the dismay of some of those who were helping him hide, Dr. Issa was open about what he'd done.
He would brag to the neighborhood people that he had killed his wife and that we were looking for him in the United States. He created an email account, fugitive@hotmail.com. And that kind of sums it up.
And when I found that out, I went, who does that? Who is so brazen that you say, yeah, I don't mind if you know that I'm a fugitive, I'm proud of it, and I'll laugh at it.
If Dr. Issa was so confident that he'd brag about murdering his wife, he might let his guard down just long enough to make a mistake, which was exactly what the FBI was counting on.
You know, Dr. Issa, you know, he was a smart guy, but I think he thought he was smarter than everybody else.
As Dr. Yazid Issa was living the high life in Beirut, U.S. and international law enforcement were watching and waiting.
Through the use of informants in the Middle East and also with law enforcement partners outside of the United States, that we were able to learn that Dr. Issa would be making his way to Cyprus.
Him going to Cyprus was a bad decision. I think he thought he could get away with it.
Unlike Lebanon, Cyprus has an extradition treaty with the United States. Cypriot police, who'd been working with the FBI and knew what flight he was on, were waiting at the airport and took him into custody.
We had some indication that he was going to travel under a false passport. When he got to Cyprus, his appearance had changed quite a bit.
Even with a false name and a false passport, Dr. Issa soon found there are some things you just can't disguise.
You can change your appearance all you want, but we were able to get fingerprints for Dr. Issa.
The FBI had Dr. Issa's fingerprints because of his work as a doctor, and his prints matched the prints of the man who just landed in Cyprus, the man who claimed he was not Yazid Issa. After 17 months on the run, Dr. Issa was finally behind bars. His lawyers tried to fight extradition, but after 2 years, he was finally back in Cleveland, in cuffs.
Finally, we have this guy who did this heinous crime, and we can make him answer for what he's done.
But that was far from a foregone conclusion.
It has all the elements of a Hollywood movie. Deadly cyanide, the doctor who had access to it, and the doctor's dead wife. He fled the country. The question is, did he actually commit murder?
The whole thing about the case is that it was circumstantial. So we had to put the case together in a fashion that would be understandable for a jury.
And they had to convince those jurors that someone who appeared to be an upstanding family man would be cold-blooded enough to hand his wife a fatal dose of poison as she walked out the door. In February of 2010, Yazid Issa went before a jury and his own family.
I think the turning point was when we had called Dr. Issa's brother to the witness stand.
Mr. Issa, if you would come forward and raise your right hand for me, please.
Dr. Issa and his brother, Firas, had been in extensive contact while Dr. Issa was in jail. On the stand, Firas Issa was caught lying about conversations he'd had with his brother, conversations that were recorded and played for the jury. Facing a perjury charge, Firas Issa changed his story.
The prosecutor comes back up and goes, "So, let me ask you again. Were you cooperating with your brother to hide this crime?" "Yes." "Did you know that he killed Rosie?" "Yes." "How did you know that?" "He told me."
What did he tell you that he did?
He said that he put the cyanide in the capsules.
When you found out that information, what did you say to your brother?
Told me he's a
And why did you say that?
He took Rosie's life. I loved her. He just ruined his whole family.
The jury, I looked over at them and they were just shocked. His own brother said, "That person killed Rosie." The case was over right there.
Prosecutors say Dr. Issa simply wanted out of his marriage, but he didn't want to lose money or custody of his children because of a divorce. So he hatched a plan to give his wife calcium pills laced with cyanide. And he gave one of these to Rosie right before she got in the car. If the plan had worked, she would have died while driving and would likely have been part of a crash violent enough to explain her death. But the pills took effect before she had picked up enough speed for a high-speed crash. So there was no serious trauma to her body and no explanation for her death. Until doctors and detectives uncovered the cyanide-laced calcium capsules, and the only person with the means, the motive, and the opportunity to lace those capsules with poison.
I still, to this day, can never understand why he didn't get rid of the evidence. To be that brazen is bizarre, but it was part of the facts of this case.
Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that you have reached a verdict in this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled and sworn, do find the defendant, Yazid Issa, guilty of aggravated murder.
In March of 2010, Dr. Yazid Issa was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for at least 20 years. Rosie's family has custody of her children, and I'm grateful she and forensic science were able to expose her killer.
To me, Rosie solved her own murder. It was pure serendipity that she was on the phone with her friend. But by her saying, Yaz wanted me to take these calcium pills, I feel like crap. Her girlfriend is going, well, geez. And so that conversation, pure chance, helped solve the case. Without that phone call, she dies. We never find out what happened.
Up next, a chance encounter results in a vicious murder.
The first people to arrive discovered a very brutal scene. There was a lot of blood.
And a lot of suspects.
We're talking in years of work, we eliminated over 400 people.
Investigators carry on despite setback after setback.
While this case may have grown cold, it was never closed.
Then forensic science, from an unrelated crime, helps expose a killer.
For whatever reason, this case just draws you in and you want to be a part of it.
Wisconsin is one of the Great Lakes states notorious for brutal winters. But for reasons no one could later explain, on a December night in 1984, a young woman decided to brave the bitter weather and walk home.
It was snowing and it was cold. She had to walk a number of miles to her home.
A few hours later, a man went out to get his newspaper and came upon a shocking sight.
The body was discovered along a gravel driveway. It was a female. She was laying on her back. She was naked from the breast down. Her head was bloodied. It was evident that she had been bludgeoned on the right side of her head.
Even veteran detectives were stunned by this level of violence. The victim had been struck with such force that cast-off blood spatter, which flies off a weapon during repeated strikes, had traveled all the way up into the surrounding trees.
She had been violently strangled, raped, and beaten in the head a number of times by this metal object. The rage and how violent the scene was disturbing.
The murder weapon was not at the scene. Blood evidence made it clear the victim had been killed where she was found. Since she wasn't frozen and temperatures were frigid, police knew she hadn't been there long. She was identified as 18-year-old Tracy Hemmerberg.
Tracy was a friendly girl. She was friends with just all the groups that one might encounter, in your typical high school. She did have some rough patches at home. She had some things she was dealing with like most, like typical high schoolers at the time and like today.
On the morning Tracy was killed, there was fresh snowfall, a potential break for investigators.
There were some tire tracks that had been left in the snow. There was also a pack of Marlboro red cigarettes that had been found in the snow also.
Tracy's murder took place in a very rural area, aside a long driveway, well away from any houses. But in another possible break, there were two potential witnesses.
There was a hunter. It was deer hunting season. and he had been out about 5:45 in the morning, and he heard a car accelerating at a high rate of speed. He saw the car come out of the driveway of the residence without any headlights on.
Another hunter says that he observes a dark sedan traveling at a high rate of speed.
But this was all the detail these two witnesses could provide. The task now was for detectives to backtrack Tracy's final hours. Her night began innocently enough. She babysat for a friend, and then she had some friends pick her up to take her to a party at this house. Nothing unusual for a Friday night.
They played a game called Quarters, where you bounce a quarter into a cup and then decide who drinks the cup of beer. They did that for some time.
Some partygoers said Tracy left about 12:30, but that seemed to be all they agreed about.
Everyone we talked to had a different way that Tracy had left the residence, and there were a lot of holes in what they were telling us.
It created some suspicion on what had occurred at that residence and what time Tracy had actually left.
For some inexplicable reason, they would not settle on one story,
which led to a lot of questions about a cover-up and what or who these partygoers were hiding. Tracy Hammerberg's autopsy confirmed what detectives at the scene surmised.
She was sexually assaulted, she was strangled, she was bludgeoned with what they described as a metallic object.
They believed that the weapon was a metallic weapon, similar in nature to a tire iron.
A possible clue was a class ring on her left hand with the initials GDW engraved on the inside. This was tracked back to Tracy's boyfriend, Glenn Wagner, but he was out of state the night of the murder and was eliminated. Another clue, skin cells under Tracy's fingernails, a clear sign she had fought for her life. A rape kit was performed, but in 1984, the resulting genetic evidence was of limited value.
At the time the crime was committed, DNA was not around yet. We weren't using that in the laboratories. The most common thing to do was ABO blood typing. So that was initially what was done early on in the case.
ABO blood typing refers to the major blood types found across all populations. Tracy's killer had type O blood, not exactly rare, but a valuable tool to connect or eliminate potential suspects.
In this particular case, the ABO blood group type was the limit of what we could do, and then make comparisons to particular individuals that law enforcement would submit.
Before Tracy left the beer party the night of the murder, a friend named David Drake offered her a ride home. By all accounts, she turned down the offer, despite the bad weather.
Tracy not taking a ride on a December night in Wisconsin is unusual.
While questioning other partygoers, detectives learned that earlier that night, David Drake arrived late to the party.
David says he's later than usual because he had a flat tire. Later, he's questioned about that flat tire. He's questioned about the tire iron that he used to change that flat tire. And he cannot explain that why he doesn't have the tire iron. He says he lost it while he was changing the tire.
What's the odds of somebody getting a flat tire and losing the tire iron on a night that a girl at his house gets murdered, and we believe the potential murder weapon is a tire iron?
But his blood type was not type O, and that eliminated him as a suspect. Meanwhile, Tracy's murder was big news in rural Wisconsin, and one tip about a man named Dale Schultz was of particular interest to detectives.
Interviews with people who surrounded Dale, he was violent, he would lose his temper, he abused women.
It was determined that Dale knew Tracy at the time, had potentially dated Tracy, had prior incidents with other girlfriends where he became very violent, actually threatened one of his former girlfriends with a tire iron, so he became a very good suspect.
He became an even better suspect when police heard a strange story about Dale Schultz from around the night of Tracy's murder. He was seen with blood on his jacket.
Dale informed the investigator that he was involved in a bar fight, and that's the reason that the blood was on his jacket.
For detectives, this seemed like more than a coincidence, and Schultz's alibi for the period of the murder wasn't exactly airtight. He was at a bar. Alcohol was involved. The memories of potential alibi witnesses were sketchy. Even more damning for investigators was the blood test. Dale Schultz was type O. Everything pointed in his direction. There was no conclusive proof. No arrest was possible, at least for now.
There were just no answers to any of the questions that were there. The violence of that encounter with Tracy was something that no one took lightly. I think it caused a realistic fear of, what is happening in our community.
And that fear lingered for years, until the arrest of a serial killer thousands of miles away created a path to the man who murdered Tracy. Weeks and then months went by with no arrests in Tracy Hammerberg's murder. The community was on edge.
There was a fear of, how did this happen? There were just no answers to any of the questions that were there.
It struck a nerve in that area. There were a lot of people, a lot of young people that, used to take rides or would go to parties without asking too many questions, that all of a sudden things changed.
Early in the investigation into Tracy's murder, detectives' main tool was the killer's blood type. As the years passed and DNA technology evolved, analysts generated the killer's DNA profile.
The best that we could do at the time was just analyze a bloodstain card from an individual or their buccal swab and compare that profile to the evidence profile and determine whether it was a match or an elimination.
With this early DNA technology, detectives attempted to test anyone with even a remote connection to Tracy. The testing, what came to be known as a DNA dragnet, eliminated Dale Schultz, the only solid suspect in the case, as well as more than 400 men who were also tested. So, despite the finding of DNA and nearly unprecedented testing of potential suspects, Tracy's case was back to square one.
It really got to the point where we were making some phone calls to the state crime lab asking, are we sure about this? Is there something that could be wrong?
DNA databases worldwide were growing by the day. If Tracy's killer committed any other violent offense, which, given the nature of the crime, seemed likely, his DNA should end up in CODIS, the U.S. criminal DNA database.
This profile in particular was entered into CODIS in July of 2000. At that time, the database wasn't necessarily that large. It did not hit at the time, and over the course of decades, it still hadn't hit in CODIS.
Nearly 20 years passed. No new suspects emerged. Neil McGrath was assigned to the case in 2005.
I read through the entire case file, reviewed photos and video from the evidence. What really made an impression on me was how violent the crime was. I felt a real responsibility to find the individual that had done this to Tracy and get him off the street.
It was never a cold case. It was a case that was always being worked on in some capacity.
And finally, that diligence appeared to pay off.
We heard about a different way of conducting DNA. We heard about forensic genetic genealogy.
In 2018, the notorious Golden State Killer was finally identified, thanks to a new breakthrough in DNA technology.
When the Golden State Killer had happened and they heard about this use of genetic genealogy, they immediately went to, well, hey, can we use genetic genealogy in this case?
This had the potential to identify Tracy's killer, but there was one problem, and it was a big one.
In 2018, investigators thought we had used our entire sample of DNA.
Genetic genealogy required a fresh DNA sample.
You need quite a bit of DNA at the time in order to develop the type of profile that is utilized for genetic genealogy, and we didn't think there was anything left to go back to.
In Tracy Hammerberg's case, the original DNA sample from her murder was copied countless times using a process called PCR, and ultimately entered into the CODIS database. But the part of a DNA sample needed for genetic genealogy is different.
For genetic genealogy, the type of DNA testing that's utilized is single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs is the acronym for it.
To do that type of testing, analysts needed something from the original DNA sample, but that might not be possible.
Because of the amount of testing that was done, the majority of the initial sample was used up.
When we determined that genetic genealogy would be the course we would take with Tracy and her case, the problem we had was we did not think we had any DNA left from the suspect.
In an attempt to save the case, Detective Scott Heller went back to the original evidence file, which had been sitting in storage for nearly 3 decades.
Scott Heller, through every piece of evidence that had been collected over the years, made contact with people at the crime lab to discuss what potentially could have DNA on it, what might not.
We found one envelope, the one that was dated correctly, the one with the right identifiers. And I think at first we couldn't believe what we were seeing. We had what we believed was going to give us the best chance to develop that profile to find Tracy's killer. It was exciting. We were beside ourselves.
This was a DNA extract remaining from the original DNA swabs. To the relief of investigators, a SNP DNA profile was generated. The question now was whether genetic genealogy could expose Tracy's killer. The key would be accessing the vast amounts of genetic material stored in both public and private DNA databases.
There's a database of people, particularly through companies such as 23andMe and Ancestry.com, where people are submitting their DNA for their own personal use, and then those databases can be searched for the purposes of law enforcement investigations.
The suspect's DNA is compared to the genetic profiles of millions of people. Some of these people, from all over the world, may share small amounts of DNA with the suspect. Slowly, this technology creates an extended genetic family tree.
The information that I was given was there was some matches to maybe a second or third cousin in the family tree. And it was just a matter of then building out the tree to find what family this individual was a part of.
I always looked at it like walking into a stadium. You know your suspect's in that stadium, and you narrow it down through the SNP from the section into the row, and then ultimately to the seat number where your suspect's going to be.
As the list of possible suspects was narrowed down, analysts looked for males who would have been living in Wisconsin way back in 1984.
We found a second marriage in a family tree. And from that produced 2 brothers that had lived in Port Washington. As we looked at their background, we found that one brother was in a lot of trouble. He had been to prison.
His name was Philip Cross. He was 21 years old at the time of Tracy's murder.
Tracy knew Philip Cross from riding the bus when they were younger in school.
Investigators also discovered that Philip Cross smoked Marlboro Red cigarettes, just like the pack of cigarettes found at the crime scene.
And he was suspected of previous incidents with eerie similarities to Tracy's murder.
He met a girl at a bar and got a ride home from her. As she was giving him a ride home, He took off his belt, put her around her neck, and started choking her. She was able to slam on the horn and break free, while Philip went running away.
Cross was never charged in this incident, so his DNA didn't get entered into CODIS. Detectives tracked him down and found him in coroner's records. He died of a drug overdose 28 years after Tracy's murder. DNA saved from his autopsy left no doubt he was the killer.
The news was bittersweet because we wanted that suspect to face justice. He was able to live his life. Tracy wasn't given that same opportunity.
A background check showed Philip Cross worked at a factory near Tracy's location the night of the murder. His shift would have ended about the time she was walking home. Investigators believe he offered her a ride, and the evidence indicates she entered his car. They drove to the isolated spot along the driveway. It appears Cross made a sexual advance, which Tracy rebuffed. The evidence indicates he choked her, almost to death, sexually assaulted her. Then he beat her to death with what they suspect was a tire iron. But unknown to him, he left conclusive proof behind. It just took nearly 35 years for DNA technology to finally reveal it.
It's touched a lot of people. I was a third-generation detective that had helped out with this investigation.
We were trying to use every investigative technique that we could to locate this killer, and fortunately science had advanced to a point that allowed us to do that.
We're in this because we want to help others, we want to bring closure to people, we want to help solve your case. A case like this that's been around for such a long time, it becomes part of you in a way. You don't want to give it up. You want to be the analyst, the final analyst that writes a report that solves that case.
Up next, an independent-minded teenager goes out on her own.
Leisha decided to be an adult and act like an adult, and she did.
But she wasn't an adult, and that made her a target.
Leisha's murder was heartbreaking and tragic.
It totally and completely changed our lives.
There are few clues, no witnesses, and lots of questions.
This case sticks with me. You've got a young 16-year-old vibrant girl, and then all of it taken away because of someone's selfish needs.
Family members say that from the time she was a child, Leisha Schollmeyer showed a streak of independence they could barely contain.
Leisha was the eldest child. I had her at a very young age, and as a result, I treated her more like a little sister, I think, than a daughter for a while.
Leisha was not your typical teenager. She was like a mini mom, and she was my everything. I was secure in this world with her.
In 1977, Leisha was 16 and determined to strike out on her own. She got her own apartment in downtown Salt Lake City.
I was married at 16, and I thought I was grown up, and I had a baby by the time I was 17, and I don't think she thought of it as being extraordinary, that she would step out and start living her own life. I never doubted her ability to do it. She did call me every Thursday night at 7 o'clock to reassure me that she was okay and that, everything was fine.
But Leisha, living by herself, was not without problems.
Someone broke into her apartment. She came home from work, and there was the door laying on the floor.
She didn't have very many possessions, you can imagine. She just a cheap little TV and stereo. But she had a jar with her teeth in it, $50, and they had taken that.
This robbery scared the normally fearless Leisha.
She told my mom, I don't feel comfortable here. I want to get out.
On a Saturday afternoon, Leisha and her mother looked for a new apartment. But on Monday, Leisha didn't show up for work, which was highly unusual.
The employer for the restaurant where she was working were concerned and called her mother. So she contacted the apartment manager and asked to be let into the apartment.
Lisa Schulmeyer was brutally strangled to death. She was placed in her bathtub, face down, with a gag in her mouth and blindfold over her eyes.
I looked in the bathroom and I saw her in the bathtub, and then I knew she was dead. I knew she was. I didn't go in. I just told the manager to go down and call the police. I just knew.
The last known contact with Leisha was 2 days earlier. The body had been there for hours, and much of the evidence had either been washed away or damaged by the water in the tub.
The medical examiner didn't find any evidence of a sexual assault. There was no biological or seminal fluid that was found.
The closest thing to a witness was the apartment manager, and he wasn't much help.
He indicated that he might have seen somebody outside in the area, but didn't give any information to the police that would have been helpful.
Detectives were perplexed by the crime scene. Drawers had been rifled. A blanket had been draped out of Leisha's bedroom and was tied to the fire escape, a possible escape route. But there was no sign of forced entry. If Leisha's killer got in by the front door, he could have left the same way.
The scene was confusing. The clothes were shredded, the knife, the ropes, the pantyhose, all that stuff. It was a chaotic scene.
Leisha had no significant defensive wounds. A knife from a matching set that came from inside the apartment was found near the body. In fact, all the implements of this crime came from inside.
The suspect came unprepared. He used everything in her apartment once he got there.
Police soon concluded nothing had been stolen. The scene had been staged to look like a robbery. Even stranger, Leisha's stereo, which had been stolen just a month before her murder, was back in her apartment, something detectives were unable to explain.
It was kind of up in the air as to how that stereo ultimately ended up back in her bedroom.
It looked like someone, other than Leisha, apparently had free access to her apartment. The question was who? The lack of forced entry into Leisha Schulmeyer's apartment and her being blindfolded led detectives to an early conclusion.
It just suggests that she knew exactly who her killer was, and he knew that she knew him.
Leisha was outgoing and had plenty of male friends, both at work and at school. As detectives prepared to contact these young men, they were stopped cold by one in particular. His name was Lonnie Passy. He lived in the apartment directly below Leisha's, and he'd recently finished a 6-year stint in jail for his involvement in a fatal bar fight.
Lonnie Passy was a person that Leisha met at jail. She went with a friend of hers to the jail because her friend's boyfriend was in jail. And they became pen pals. And she would write to him. And so when Lonnie got out of jail, he moved into the same apartment complex that Leisha was living in.
And he expressed a clear, romantic interest in Leisha.
He was a con. He had been in jail. And so he came out thinking that he was going to hook up with her, and she was not interested.
She said, I like your car, but I don't like you. And that's kind of how my sister was. She didn't like pussyfoot over everybody's feelings, you know?
This hardly tied Lonnie to Leisha's murder, but something else appeared to. He had scratches across his upper body.
He had indicated to police that he had received those scratch marks a week or two before.
But that's not what the medical examiner said. she told police that Lonnie's scratches were just a few days old. This would have been around the time of Leisha's murder, and Lonnie's alibi for these scratches, in fact, all of his alibis, eventually collapsed.
The night of the homicide, Lonnie claims he was with his girlfriend Kathy at the time. So that was his alibi. Later, she states she was not with Lonnie, nor did she ever give him those scratches.
And since Leisha knew Lonnie, she would most likely have let him into her apartment. Even stranger was the mystery stereo, the one that had been stolen and then suddenly reappeared in Leisha's apartment after her murder.
The stereo had previously been seen in Lonnie Passey's apartment, and so for it to end up back in her apartment is a lot of suspicion as to how that stereo got there.
Everything pointed to Lonnie. The problem was that detectives couldn't prove anything. Even worse, DNA in crime science didn't even exist. This was 1977, a full 10 years before the world's first ever DNA conviction. Leisha's rape kit came up empty, even for blood type.
Back in the 70s, there was no crime lab that had any specialization on sex assault kits that could determine if there was sperm present or anything like that.
There was no hard evidence against Lonnie or anyone else. Years and then decades slipped by. Leisha's case got colder and colder.
So all leads had gone, and there was nothing else that they could do. And unfortunately, the case, like many others, went to the bottom of a heap, to a pile of unsolved crimes.
It gets to the point where you don't even tell people it happened because it's an open hole in your life.
But detectives and Leisha's family never fully gave up hope. Her mother went over every possibility and kept in contact with detectives.
A lot of people, when I watch your show, I hear them say how they can't go on. And you know, that's one thing you've got to do. You've got to go on. And I had 4 children at home that needed me to go on. And I did it for them.
My mom was watching Forensic Files, and she was watching all these things, and every time a case was solved that was that many years old, she'd be like, well, then Leisha's could be solved. I didn't know she was doing that, because I would have probably told her to stop it, you know, because I didn't believe in it.
But as time passed, they started to believe, and forensic science ultimately justified their faith. At the dawn of the 21st century, DNA technology was revolutionizing how police investigated crimes. Many cases that had gone stone cold were reopened, including Leisha Scholmeyer's.
When you have DNA, it's not just the evidence from before. Now we can open up new doors, take that very same evidence, and find DNA out of a cloth that was tied up for a gag to be put in her mouth.
Detective Hillary Gordon was one of the investigators assigned to Leisha's case when it was reopened in 2016.
I thought it was a very solvable case, and I just found it fascinating. Every time I had a free moment, I would work on this case and read through every transcript, every interview, every detail.
As Detective Gordon re-examined the case file, she noticed something detectives back in the 70s would not have focused on.
I noticed that the photographs of the victim in her bathtub showed her face down, and the knots from the blindfold and the gag were at the back of her head and were not submerged in water.
Large amounts of skin cells would be sloughed off while tying the knots on those pieces of clothing, a potentially rich source of DNA. That is, if those items were still in evidence, and if they hadn't been contaminated by investigators not familiar with DNA.
Did they use gloves to move her out of the bathtub? Who touched her, moving her from the scene to the medical examiner's office that could have left DNA? And one photograph I was able to collect from The medical examiner's office of the autopsy showed them wearing gloves, and I was so thrilled.
Amazingly, nearly 40 years after the crime, the gag and blindfold from the scene were still in evidence storage, and in a key break, the knots had not been untied.
When I pulled it out of the bag, it was still tied in the exact same way that it had been when it was on her body. The gag and the blindfold were still completely intact.
In 2013, traditional swabbing generated Leisha's DNA and also some DNA from an unidentified male.
They tried conventional swabbing, and we did find YSDR DNA, and YSDR DNA focuses in on the male chromosome, the Y chromosome, but it just wasn't enough to develop a full SDR profile.
And that full profile was needed to provide a conclusive identification. So, with new forensic technology coming online every year, investigators waited for tech to catch up to their case. And in 2016, it looked like it might have, in the form of a new forensic tool called MVAC.
MVAC gives investigators opportunities to collect DNA where they couldn't get it before, especially the rough and porous surfaces like rocks, bricks, even some clothing items, where traditional methods like swabbing and scraping and cuttings won't necessarily collect the amount of DNA that's needed to produce a good profile.
MVAC has been known to gather 39 times more DNA than traditional swabbing. But would it work on a couple of flimsy pieces of cloth that had been sitting in storage for almost 40 years? If so, the knots tied in those pieces of cloth would be key.
We're going to target those because we feel like those have been manipulated the most, knotting up and interacting with the suspect's hands.
MVAC essentially bathes the test item in a neutral solution. This loosens up the DNA, which is then vacuumed up for analysis. The solution is extracted, leaving the DNA behind.
Next step is something called amplification. DNA amplification is the DNA photocopier of forensics, taking small amounts of DNA and making it into massive amounts of DNA.
The result, in addition to Leisha's DNA, was a full male profile, almost certainly the killer's.
We come back and say, it worked. It worked. Those kind of wow moments, those light bulb moments are amazing. And they're so few and far between that when they happen, you just have to relish it and you have to celebrate.
Now investigators turned to their top suspect. Lonnie Passy had been on their radar since Leisha's murder, and they were convinced this DNA profile would tie him to the crime. But DNA doesn't lie.
I was absolutely shocked, but now it makes so much sense.
In the 4 decades since Leisha Schollmeyer's murder, detectives and her family kept a close watch on Lonnie Passy, the chief suspect. In 2016, they were convinced their new DNA profile would prove Lonnie was Leisha's killer, and were stunned to find they were mistaken.
I was absolutely shocked that it did not match Lonnie Passy because we thought he was absolutely the guy for this homicide.
Lonnie had nothing to do with it. I don't know where Lonnie got the scratches. That's the million-dollar question, I suppose. But Lonnie didn't have anything to do with this homicide.
But investigators were not back to square one. They entered the MVAC-generated genetic profile into CODIS, the National DNA Database, and were stunned yet again.
And I couldn't believe it. I was so excited. I stood up in the office and I started jumping up and down and I was yelling, "Oh my God, we solved this case, we've solved this case."
The DNA profile matched Patrick McCabe, the apartment manager who led Leisha's mom to her body way back in 1977.
I was aghast that he actually had the nerve to walk into that apartment with me, knowing I was going to find the woman he had killed. And he stood right there and actually called the police for me. I mean, what kind of a sick person is like that, you know? I have no idea. No idea.
How could you do that to another human being? How could you do that to the mom, that you would allow that to happen to her? To see her own daughter killed in such a violent fashion. It's cold.
McCabe, 20 years old at the time of Leisha's murder, knew she lived alone, and he had the keys to all the apartments in the complex. Back in 1977, police were so convinced Lonnie Passy was the killer that McCabe slipped away.
McCabe ultimately wound up in Florida.
His DNA entered the database because of another sexually motivated crime.
In 1998, he had sexually assaulted a 14-year-old and had been convicted of that crime and sent to prison for a year for that crime.
40 long years after Leisha's murder, McCabe was finally confronted with the evidence. He soon realized science had caught up with him and confessed.
I went up to her apartment. It was dark. I raped her. Once that sexual arousal was released, I guess it all came panic. What am I going to do now? And that's when I started back to her.
McCabe took a plea deal and was sentenced to 10 years to life.
We could never give him what he deserves. We'd have to be like him to do it. He got 40 years of freedom. No, he didn't get what he deserves.
Investigators believe McCabe long planned to rape Leisha. On the night of the murder, he used his key, entered the apartment, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and attacked her while she slept. She could do nothing as he tied her up and gagged her before the assault. Then, knowing she could identify him, he convinced himself he had no choice but to kill her. He strangled her and submerged her in the tub, hoping the evidence would wash away, which it did, until the MVAC conclusively tied him to a crime he'd gotten away with for 40 long years.
Cops are only human, and they're only given what evidence they can find and that, but a machine that can go so much further into the molecules and it gives the police so much weaponry to fight with.
In the process of inventing the MVAC, my dad always had the understanding that the reason that he was given the resources to develop the MVAC was to make a difference. It was to help somebody that couldn't be helped otherwise.
The MVAC was superb. It did exactly what we wanted it to do. It gave Leisha justice. It gave her family closure. It put a very horrible person in prison. It ultimately just did what all of us couldn't do for 40 years.
Someone's selfish needs.
Family members.
And as a result, I treated her more like a little sister, I think, than a daughter for a while.
Leisha, mom, and she was my everything. I was secure in this world with her.
Restaurant where she was working were concerned and called her mother. So she contacted the
face down with a gag in her mouth and blindfold over her eyes.
I looked in the...
Was who? Conclusion.
It just suggests that she knew exactly who her killer was, and he knew that she knew him.
Leisha was outgoing.
Khan, he had been in jail, and so he came out thinking that he was going to hook up with her, and she's...
I like your car, but I don't like you. And that's kind of how my sister was. She didn't like pussyfoot over everybody's feelings, you know.
Had indicated to police that he had received those scratch marks a week or two before.
Eventually collapsed.
The night of the homicide, Lonnie claims he was with his girlfriend Kathy at the time. So that was his...
They justified their fate.
When you have DNA, it's not just the evidence from before. Now we can open up new doors, take that very same evidence and find DNA.
I had a free moment. I would work on this case and read through every transcript, every interview, every detail.
As Detective Gordon justified male.
They tried conventional swabbing, and we did find YSD.
MVAC gives investigators opportunities to collect DNA where they couldn't get it before, especially the rough and porous surfaces.
Pieces of cloth would be key.
We're going to target those because we feel like those have been manipulated the most. Knotting up and interacting with...
Doesn't lie.
I was absolutely shocked, but now it makes so much sense.
Mistaken.
I was absolutely shocked that it did not match Lonnie Passy because we thought he was absolutely the guy for this homicide.
Lonnie had nothing to do with it. I don't know where Lonnie got the scratches. That's the million-dollar question, I suppose. But Lonnie didn't have anything to do with this homicide.
But investigators...
I was aghast that he actually had the nerve to walk into that apartment with me, knowing I was going to find the woman.
You do that to the mom, that you would allow that to happen to her, to see her own daughter.
Long years after Leisha's murder, McCabe was finally confronted with the evidence. He soon realized science had caught up with him and confessed.
I went up to her apartment. It was dark. I raped her. Once that sexual arousal was released, I guess it all came panic. What am I going to do now? And that's when I started panicking.
McCabe took a plea deal and was sentenced to 10 years to life.
We could never give him what he deserves. We'd have to be like him to do it. He got 40 years of freedom.
The understanding that the reason that he was given the resources to develop the MVAC was to make a difference. It was to help somebody.
What we wanted it to do. It gave Leisha justice. It gave her family closure. It put a very horrible person in prison. It ultimately just did what all of us couldn't do for 40 years.
Up next, even police have to admit this killer has left nothing to chance.
He is methodical and playing head games with law enforcement.
And he's determined that his victim never be identified.
It brought tears to my eyes to see that someone had been so tortured.
A photo is released, and soon the general public is on the case.
So I ended up on Web Sleuths, a place where a lot of armchair detectives, a lot of internet sleuths, a lot of true crime enthusiasts go.
They were able to identify her. So now we know who this body belongs to.
It was just a shot in the dark, and it worked out.
On an April afternoon in 1998, a couple driving in rural south-central Utah made a discovery that would consume local law enforcement for more than 2 decades.
It was a spring day where husband and wife are driving along. They observe something off the side of the highway that looked suspicious to them. They stopped to see what it was, and that's when they located the body.
The female victim was wrapped in plastic, tied with rope and duct tape, rolled up in a child's playmat, and stuffed into a sleeping bag. The cause of death was a single execution-style gunshot to the head. The victim was wearing only a bra and panties and had no identification. The killer had made sure even estimating a time of death would be impossible.
This body had been in a deep freeze prior to it being found. And in April, the temperatures would have been 60, 70 degrees. In her state, being in a completely horizontal, flat laid out position was apparently after death was placed in a freezer where the body could be frozen.
It was clear that whoever killed this woman wanted to make it as hard as possible to make an identification.
Law enforcement struggled to identify the woman because her fingertips had been cut off.
Someone, I don't know if they had a rough blade or whatever, but it was horrible.
All of this post-mortem activity, the wrapping of the body, the removal of the fingertips, would have taken a lot of time, a lot of privacy, and a lot of planning.
Whoever did this, I'd say they pretty much knew what they were doing. They did not want to leave any trace of this person. And they made sure.
It was very well thought out, planned, methodical, the way that this was done. I would argue it wasn't a first time that they had done something like this. It wasn't done in a hurry.
The victim was about 5 feet tall, dark-haired, had brown eyes, appeared to be around 40 years old, and could possibly be of Hispanic or Native American descent. And that's all investigators had to tell them who she was. So they turned to material found with her body.
As far as evidence, the duct tape on her face was good evidence to use to try and find out who the perpetrator was or who the suspect was. Anything that was touching her body was good evidence.
A sketch of the victim's face was released to the media, but no solid leads emerged. The National Crime Information Center and FBI database also yielded nothing. The duct tape wrapping the body was tested, but no prints or DNA were found.
The perpetrator in this case had taken some great care and precautions in hiding his identity.
At this point, the victim had no name, but she acquired one during the course of the investigation.
This Jane Doe, since she was found near Maiden Water Spring, she eventually became known as the Maiden Water victim.
As the weeks, months, and ultimately years wore on, investigators worried that would be the only name they'd ever have for this victim.
They exhausted the leads, hit dead ends, and there really became nothing more to follow up on.
Hopeful that forensic technology would catch up to their case, all the evidence from the Maiden Water murder was put in storage. In 2008, 10 years after the body was found, the materials used to wrap the body, the duct tape, the sleeping bag, the rope, and the playmat, were tested for DNA.
They went through the evidence. They were looking for touch DNA that would indicate a suspect. And through that effort, they weren't successful in obtaining anything other than the victim's own DNA.
But the rope, or more accurately, the knots in the rope, resulted in the first solid lead. This led to 42-year-old Scott Kimball, serving life in a Colorado prison for killing 4 people, and he was suspected in a number of other murders.
One of the reasons law enforcement believed Scott Kimball to be a person of interest was because he had tied up other victims in the same manner.
The knots in both cases were unusually elaborate, and to the untrained eye, looked identical.
The ropes from his victim were collected from the law enforcement in Colorado, and we took our ropes and our knots from our maiden water victim here in Utah, and we've been referred to a knot expert that the FBI had used to analyze and compare the knots.
This expert concluded that the knots from Scott Kimball's case and the knots used to bind the maiden water victim, while not perfectly identical, could very possibly have been tied by the same person. And there were other reasons Scott Kimball could be the man detectives were looking for.
At the time, in 1998, Scott Kimball worked for some type of a meat company, and he would deliver frozen beef in a refrigerated truck. And he would deliver frozen beef in Colorado and Utah, some of those just the surrounding states.
Kimball clearly had the means to freeze his victim.
There was already a workup through FBI on Scott Kimball at that time. They'd done a timeline. They'd done association charts and stuff like that, kind of like the analytical stuff that needs to be done as the case goes on.
Some of Kimball's victims were shot execution style with a small caliber weapon and were dumped next to rural roadways after being wrapped in rugs and tarps. One suspected victim had both hands severed after death.
There was another female he admitted to killing. The body was apparently left and dumped and dismembered in eastern Utah. So in 2017, we got to a point where we determined that we should just go and interview him in person and see what he said.
But if investigators thought Kimball might be willing to talk, they were sadly mistaken. He knocked down the idea that the knots tied him to the maiden water murder.
I'm not a knot expert, but we do have a knot expert looking at these. He's just completing his analysis on them to see if they're the same knot, if the same person tied those same knots.
Well, just remember this. In everything I learned from being on a Boy Scout troop, Cub Scouts, that type of thing. Things that you use in ranching, those are, there's basic knots, there's basic half-inch knots. There's all kinds of knots that they're not unique to an industry,
Investigators reminded him that DNA technology was getting more sophisticated by the day. Kimball was unfazed.
To be honest, if you had any physical evidence on any crime, you would arrest me. If you had fingerprints, if you had DNA, if you had a witness, if you had any of those things, you would arrest me. But you can't have those because I wasn't there.
Well, there's still things we are waiting on.
You're just wasting your time. You really are. You should be looking at other suspects or other cold cases that you could solve.
Investigators had to concede Scott Kimball was their one and only suspect, and they had no evidence that tied him, or anyone else for that matter, to their victim, who still had not been identified.
The case kind of went cold because we weren't really getting a lot of information from anybody, so it went cold.
In 2018, detectives on the Maiden Water case, despairing that without an identification for their victim, the case would never be solved, made an unusual decision.
We had a photograph of our victim where she was deceased. It was her face only. It was not graphic or gory. And we felt like it was something that we could potentially release to the public. We feel like we've exhausted every other possible lead, and we had to do this.
These days, local news takes on a whole new meaning. A local story can go global, or at least national, in no time. And the undeniable popularity of true crime means there are scores of people whose hobby is researching real-life cases. Mandy Hart is one of them.
I found myself on a website called Web Sleuths. And then I fell into a rabbit hole of investigation, if you will. Web Sleuths is a website for people all over the world to join together and talk about crime.
Mandy became particularly interested in cold cases involving unidentified victims.
I think I was really drawn to that particular portion of the website just because I was really unaware of how many people are unidentified. And that is where I ultimately came across the case that was known at that time as the Maidenwater victim.
Mandy did a deep dive on this case, collated all the information she could find, and logged on to an organization called NamUs, which was also used by investigators in Utah working the Maidenwater case.
The case was put into the National Missing and Unidentified site, NamUs. I work with that site all the time because it's a national database and it's for the public and it's for law enforcement. It's a great tool.
I found 8 to 10 matches, and I just started going through each missing person case one at a time. And I had a photo of her deceased, which is very rare to actually have.
Mandy checked the face of the Maidenwater victim against photos of women who had gone missing.
I could rule them out based on the photo. I had her photo up on half of my screen, and I went through and kind of said no, 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 by photo, really, until I came to maybe the 5th or 6th one. And the 5th or 6th one was the missing person profile for Lena Reyes Geddes. And there was a good photo of her face, and immediately I stopped and kind of looked back and forth and said, okay, I want to read more about this one.
37-year-old Lena Reyes Geddes went missing after leaving her Youngstown, Ohio home in 1998. In what could be more than a coincidence, the Maidenwater victim was found in Utah, 12 days after Lena disappeared.
I went looking at her ethnicity, it was a match. Her height, it was a match. Her weight, it was a match. And I'm kind of like, okay, the location was the only thing that was not a match.
But the breakthrough came from something smaller than a pea. The physical description of the Maidenwater victim, the one Utah detectives had uploaded to NamUs, indicated she had a small mole on the top of her right ear. And so did Lena Reyes Geddes.
And that was the time that I literally, my blood just like went cold, that all the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and immediately I was like 100% knew that these two people that I was looking at were the same person.
True crime hobbyist Mandy Hart had a long-shot hunch she'd identified a murder victim from a 20-year-old cold case out of Youngstown, Ohio.
Like, how do you even describe like how I knew what I knew, you know, without sounding like a total weirdo?
To her surprise, she found a very receptive audience in a Youngstown detective.
Detective Sweeney in Ohio, he said 99% sure that it was her, and they needed science to prove it.
Looking at the pictures, I could see the mole in the ear, and when I saw that, I thought, wow, we do have a match here, but we need to confirm it with DNA.
Detectives did a background check on Lena Reyes Geddes and used DNA from family members to confirm her identity.
Lena was really essentially the shining star of her family. She was a ballet dancer. She had a university degree. She was successful. She was smart.
2 years before she went missing, Lena married Edward Geddes, a successful Ohio businessman. This was his third marriage.
Edward Geddes had his own business within the city of Youngstown, and it was a commercial soap chemical business. There was a huge age difference between the two.
Detectives now got some shocking news. Edward Geddes took his own life in 2001, but he had been questioned back in 1998, shortly after Lena disappeared. Edward said Lena was visiting family in Mexico and never returned. He vividly recalled the day she left.
She'd come out of the shower and she'd have the towel wrapped around her thing, and she would put on a pair of underpants and a bra. Okay, and then she would, start working with her hair. I can tell you what underpants and bra she had on. They were white cotton, and the bra. The reason I remember it is it was my favorite pants and bra. It was white cotton with pictures of apples and maybe bananas on it. Okay.
This matched undergarments from the crime scene. According to Edward, there were no problems in the marriage.
I didn't come into the airport. We kissed. I was out of the car. We kissed. Skycap picked off the stuff and we went into the Pittsburgh airport. That's the last time I saw her.
Lena's family said she'd never made it to Mexico. And ominously, Edward never reported her missing.
To me, that's suspicious. Do you think that there would be some feelings or some idea that maybe my wife is missing, that I need to call someone?
Lena said something to a close friend in an English language class shortly before she went missing. That further raised the specter of Edward as her killer.
Lena said that if something happened to her, she passed a note to her friend so she would be able to contact Lena's family members.
Edward was abusive. He was controlling. I believe Lena wanted to leave him. She was afraid of him and wanted to be away from him. And I believe that he didn't want that to happen. He did not want Lena to leave him. And I believe that is the motive.
He appeared to be the only person with a motive. But even after all this time, it seemed there was no way to tie him to Lena's murder.
We've tested evidence 2 and 3 times with no success. No DNA was ever found other than Lena's.
But now analysts turn back to the rope used to bind Lena.
Whoever tied her up and put her in that position had to have handled that rope and made those knots. So we knew we wanted to focus on those knotted areas and that rope.
What made the rope so important as evidence was a new forensic tool called MVAC. With MVAC, it was now possible to lift DNA from all sorts of materials that were previously out of bounds, including something rough and porous like rope.
How the MVAC works is really fairly simple. Let's look at the MVAC like a mini carpet cleaner. It sprays a very clean, sterile solution on the item of evidence, and it gets that solution into the tiny nooks and crannies, the weave of something, and then you suck it up, the vacuum sucks it up, and it deposits it into a small, sterile bottle. And in that solution would be the skin cells that were deposited, hopefully, by the perpetrator.
A male DNA profile was lifted from the rope, and when tested against DNA from known relatives of Edward Geddes, the 2-decade-plus mystery of who killed the Maidenwater victim was finally solved. Ultimately, even in death, Edward Geddes couldn't hide. Technology thwarted all of his attempts to conceal his role in his wife's murder.
Edward Geddes was the killer. It turned out that Edward Geddes was the one who left the DNA on those knots, on those ropes. He is the one that handled them, that tied it, that cinched. It was him.
No one is sure exactly what happened when Edward killed Lena. What's not in dispute is that he went to unusual lengths to keep her and himself from being identified. But he made 2 key mistakes. He never knew that when he handled the ropes, he left his DNA behind. And in a fitting irony, when he froze Lena's body in an attempt to conceal her time of death, all decomposition stopped, which meant her face was perfectly preserved when she was later photographed by police. And that photo finally led to her identification and gave her family some measure of justice, despite the passage of more than 20 years.
I do honestly believe I was drawn into this case. Divine intervention. I don't know why. This isn't something that I had done before or that I really have done since. I'm just thankful that I was a part of it.
It wasn't just forensic science that was crucial to it. It was everybody working together. It was like putting a puzzle together, and everybody added a piece in this puzzle and helped bring the whole picture and make it clear. And we all helped each other. And when we had that DNA, that was it. The puzzle was solved.
Up next, a desperate woman struggles to survive.
She was trying to get to the phone. Hard to say if that was before or after she was shot.
Police have a solid suspect, but he's got an airtight alibi.
This is not your prototypical killer. We were looking everywhere to try to get to the bottom of this mystery.
The killer knows how to destroy evidence and nearly succeeds.
I've had a number of cases where individuals have tried to obliterate the microscopic marks produced by the barrel. Luckily for forensic scientists, some of these folks don't know what they're doing.
Southern Pennsylvania is dotted with numerous small towns and communities centered around farming and agriculture.
York County, Pennsylvania is right along the border with Maryland, with a history that goes back prior to the Civil War. It has some involvement in the Battle of Gettysburg.
Violent crime is a rarity in the area. So when, on a March afternoon in 2010, a 911 operator got a call with no response on the other end, it was assumed to be an accidental call.
York County 911 dispatcher 65. Hello? Hello?
99% of those turn out to be totally nothing, either a kid playing with a phone or something along those lines. It's nothing that would raise an alarm.
The York County Control hung up the phone and called back and received a busy signal, so that means that the line is still open.
The call was from a landline, from the home of a 55-year-old woman named Monica Schmeier. An officer responded to the house, located in a very remote area.
Monica's house is located on the top of a hill. You can only get there through the kind of a winding driveway that gets to the home.
Police arrived, announced their presence, but got no response. The reason became clear shortly after they entered the residence.
So I was the second one on scene. She was on the floor in the living room, and she was obviously deceased. We suspected a gunshot wound to the head, but we weren't 100% sure exactly what was going on.
The victim was identified as Monica Schmeier. On the floor next to her body was a single .32 caliber shell casing. The brand, Speer, was plainly visible. At first, there was no sign of a struggle in the house.
If anything jumped out at the beginning, it was possibly more of a suicidal situation, that it was a possibility that she had killed herself. That was the initial thought.
But a quick survey of the scene put that theory to rest. There was no gun in the house. Monica's face was bloody and bruised, indicating she'd been struck in the head. A blood trail across the floor led to her body.
She had blood on the inside of her thighs that were in a pattern consistent with dripping downward into her inner thighs, as well as blood on the soles of her feet and her socks. So at some point in time, she had gotten up from where she had been sitting and bleeding and moved across the floor towards the phone, where she was ultimately killed.
In fact, it appeared Monica's last act was to call 911. This provided a vital clue.
The 911 call becomes so important because they can pinpoint exactly when the call was made. 2:52. How does that help them? Well, it helps them narrow down the time of death.
Police were puzzled. No motive for this murder was immediately apparent.
Her purse was found inside the house. There was lots of other personal property. There was cameras and phones and TVs and VCRs.
Even stranger, there were a lot of white envelopes all over the room, and they were filled with cash.
Monica had an interesting way of handling cash and paying her bills. She didn't trust banks, so she kept cash in her home whenever she needed it.
If the killer left thousands of dollars behind, murder would seem to be the only motive. But who would want Monica Schmeier dead? It didn't take long to find a suspect.
Experience shows that, you know, somebody's going to kill you, they usually know you, and it's usually someone very close to you.
Monica Schmeier met her husband, John, at medical school in the late 1970s. When they married, she gave up her medical career to be a stay-at-home mom to the couple's 2 daughters. John Schmeier built a successful ophthalmology practice. Life, at least for a while, was good.
According to Monica, John seemed to develop a wandering eye, and when she found out about it, being a Catholic as she was, she didn't want to get a divorce. So she actually stayed with John for a number of years.
Monica eventually consented to a divorce, at least on paper.
In Monica's mind, regardless of what the divorce papers said, they were married and they were until death do they part.
When detectives notified John Schmeier of his ex-wife's execution-style murder, his reaction struck them as more than a little unusual.
It looked more like an act than a natural reaction. He would cry and then look up, and cry and look up, and there were no tears. He would go from crying to talking, back to crying, back to talking, but there was never a tear.
Schmeier readily admitted he and Monica had issues. He said he wanted to move on from the marriage, but Monica insisted on being part of his life.
He was very frustrated with the divorce, how things were going. It had been drawn out. It had been a couple years since they had split.
And Schmeier was known to complain about this. Friends said that what he found particularly galling was not how much he paid in alimony, but how Monica insisted it be paid.
She didn't trust banks, so John would pay Monica in cash every month. She would set that money aside, apportioning it for her bills. Then she would go back to John, give him that cash back, and he would write the checks to the utilities or others that she owed money to.
Try as he might, Schmeier couldn't free himself from his now ex-wife, but he insisted he had nothing to do with her murder. Police knew, practically to the minute, when that murder happened, and Schmeier said he had an alibi. He was at a local restaurant with a group of friends who called themselves the Orange Shorts Society.
The Orange Shorts Society, which is a group of middle-aged men that get together once a week at a local restaurant, and they would, you know, talk about politics, money, investments, whatever, but they were all well-to-do men.
On the afternoon of Monica's murder, most of the usual group met, and they confirmed John Schmeier was there.
At first blush, it did seem that he had an alibi, but you could still be a hire for murder type situation. There seemed to be enough bad blood there. It would appear that he could gain substantially from her death.
So now investigators turned to what little evidence they had. An autopsy revealed Monica died from a close-range gunshot to the head. A .32 caliber bullet, consistent with the casing found at the scene, was recovered and forensically examined.
The general rifling characteristics list that was populated showed that firearms produced by Colt, Dixon, and Kel-Tec were among the firearms that could have fired this particular specimen.
While the bullet was damaged, it had sufficient markings to match it to the murder weapon if only that gun could be found.
If you submit a gun or you submit a barrel, then we can go and test fire those and compare them to this particular weapon.
There were possible witnesses to the murder. Even though Monica's house was well off the road, a neighbor saw a man walking in the direction of her house shortly before she made the 911 call. About 20 minutes later, the man appeared again, walking away from Monica's house.
He sees that same man walking in what he described as walking with a purpose, carrying what he believed to be a white envelope in his hand, which then, you know, we immediately say, oh, white envelope, white envelope. We had white envelopes at the scene with cash.
The man was described as a white male, approximately 5'9", with a medium build. A second witness said he also saw a man matching that same description, walking up a hill away from Monica's house, and that he drove away in a silver van.
Not a, soccer mom van, not a big box truck, but like a work van, a work type van parked facing down the hill.
So far, these witness descriptions were all detectives had to identify this man. It couldn't be said for certain if he even had anything to do with Monica's murder, or if he had any ties to Monica's ex-husband.
We'll come up with 15 different ways this thing happened. We got to find the right one and prove that one. That's sort of the name of the game.
The prime suspect in the murder of Monica Schmeier was a man seen near her home on the day of the murder. Detectives focused on the vehicle the man was driving, a silver full-sized van. The witness who saw the van didn't get a license plate and didn't know the make of the vehicle.
There was no specific markings about it. We found about 50 different silver vans. We had vans. We don't know if we had the van.
Businesses in nearby towns were canvassed. Detectives hoped either man or machine had seen the van.
Everybody has cameras. Everybody's, banks and stores and ATMs. And, there's cameras everywhere nowadays. So it's a cursory thing for us. We'll check all the video.
A bank in a town about 3 miles from Monica's house captured video of a full-sized silver van heading in the direction of her house about 15 minutes before the murder.
You see that same van twice on the video, once prior to the time of death and once after the time of death, corresponding the direction of travel as far as to and from the house.
But the video was blurry, and attempts to enhance it were unsuccessful.
There was no way to try to get a license plate or anything along those lines because the camera itself is designed and focused on people entering and exiting the bank, not in the background.
Which put the investigation almost back to square one. Since Monica didn't date, there were no ex or current boyfriends in the picture, and the possibility of this being a random murder was dismissed out of hand.
You just didn't find this house on a whim. This was a house that you had to know was there. We knew we had to find a connection to Monica. We just didn't know what that connection was yet.
Searching for anything he could have missed, Detective Doug Demangon reviewed his notes and found something interesting from his initial interviews with friends of Monica's ex-husband, the members of the Orange Shorts Society. On the afternoon of the murder, the group was joined by a young woman named Sarah, who was engaged to be married to one of the members.
I'm going through my notebook and I'm getting to my interview with Sarah. And I'm looking and I'm flipping and I see the name Tim Jacoby at the top of this piece of paper.
Tim Jacoby was the only regular member of the Orange Shorts Society who wasn't present that day.
And I went, oh my gosh. I said, I never really looked into this guy. And I then pull his driver's license photo up. And again, oh my gosh. His height fits, his description fits, everything fits.
Jacoby was 37 years old, had a good job as an engineer, and didn't appear, at first, to be a cold-blooded killer.
And then as you dug a little deeper, oddly enough, you found that he had this armed robbery history.
I find that he has a prior robbery arrest where he involved a takeover of a jewelry store where he ended up dropping the jewelry as he was fleeing.
Jacoby pleaded no contest and, with no prior criminal history, escaped jail time. Records showed he owned a .32 caliber Kel-Tec semi-automatic pistol.
The bells are going off now because a .32 caliber is what they're looking for. That is the shell casing they found at the scene of the crime.
While Jacoby didn't know Monica, detectives say they had never met. He did know of her through John Schmeier and the Orange Shorts Society.
I take it to all of our investigators and say, here we go. Tim knows John. So now is this a whole conspiracy that John pays Tim to knock off Monica? So now we're back in full throttle and we're moving ahead.
After weeks of frustration, detectives finally had a possible suspect in the murder of Monica Schmeier. Tim Jacoby fit witness descriptions. He knew where Monica lived, and employment records showed he was driving a company van, a full-sized silver van, just like a witness saw on the day of the murder.
It's the same make, same model, same year, same color, everything. Circumstantially, when you look at it, it's the same van as the one we saw in the video going towards Monica's house at 2:38 and coming back through at 2:59.
A search warrant was executed on Jacoby's home. His live-in fiancée, Sarah, didn't take it well.
She literally threw up. When I was talking to her, she got so worked up, she was hyperventilating and she vomited in a garbage can.
Detectives didn't find a .32 caliber gun, but they did find a .32 caliber Kel-Tec gun barrel. The rest of the gun was nowhere to be found. But the gun barrel would be consistent with a murder weapon. There was one problem. Someone had scoured the inside of the barrel, an apparent attempt to destroy it as a piece of evidence.
These particular marks were probably produced by a hard surface tool that was used to scratch or to actually mark the lands and grooves inside the barrel.
Test bullets were fired through the damaged barrel, but the scratches apparently worked. They prevented a definitive match from being made to the bullet recovered from Monica's autopsy.
The bullets lacked sufficient microscopic marks to render an opinion of an identification.
Detectives now learned that Jacoby often used his parents' nearby farm for target practice. Teams of forensic analysts descended on the property.
We found the box to the Kel-Tec gun. We found the receipt for the Kel-Tec gun. We found ammunition for the Kel-Tec 32.
But still no gun. However, in the area where Jacoby did his target practice, investigators found 4 spent shell casings from a .32 caliber. It was hard to say how long these casings had been there.
Once those particular cartridge cases were cleaned up, the examiner was able to see that these were manufactured by Speer. They were .32 auto caliber. It's the same as the cartridge case that was recovered at the scene of the crime.
In the same way that bullets are made distinctive by the gun that fires them, shell casings also retain tool marks that are unique to a particular weapon. Microscopic markings on the base of the casings were compared under a microscope to the casing recovered from Monica's living room, and they matched.
The opinion that was rendered was that, in fact, all of these cartridge cases were fired from the same firearm.
That definitively tied Tim Jacoby, or at least shell casings on his parents' property, to the fatal bullet. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But one question remained. Why would he kill someone he didn't even know?
On face value, Tim would not have had any reason to kill Monica, unless hired by John to do so.
Investigators did a deep dive into John Schmeier's financial records, looking for any kind of payment to Jacoby. There was nothing there.
We were unable to substantiate any kind of connection between John, Sarah, and Tim, and then it got to the point where, okay, we've now eliminated John.
Investigators believe Tim Jacoby targeted Monica not for murder, but robbery. He knew there were thousands of dollars of cash laying around her house. After all, his friend John Schmeier complained about it all the time.
I think he listened to the stories. I think he knew about the money. I think he knew about the envelopes.
Investigators believe Jacoby drove to the house that day in his silver work van. He parked up the street, entered the house, and pointed the gun at Monica while he tried to scoop up envelopes containing money. But Monica fought back, or tried to run away. Jacoby hit her in the face, knocking her to the ground. As he looked for more envelopes, it appears Monica crawled to the phone and called 911. Jacoby rushed over and shot her in the head. He took several envelopes filled with cash and walked back to the van, where he was seen by Monica's neighbors. He got rid of the gun, but the shell casings left earlier at his makeshift target range matched the single bullet casing next to Monica's body. In October of 2014, Tim Jacoby was convicted of charges including first-degree murder and sentenced to death, largely because of microscopic tool marks on shell casings he apparently didn't even know were there. Jacoby remains on death row.
This case was definitely a whodunit. And in my 28 years of law enforcement, we didn't really get a whole lot of good whodunits. It took a lot of time and energy to get to the bottom. This was a challenge for our little police department. And luckily and happily, it turned out good.
When we started, we had a 1,000-piece puzzle, and we didn't have the edges done. So, the forensic evidence gave us the edges in the middle, and we were able to put all that whole picture together so that when the jury looked at those puzzle pieces, they didn't see puzzle pieces. They saw the picture on the box.
Up next, these robbery teams appear to be skilled professionals.
They got more bold and brazen with how they were committing the acts.
So bold and brazen that a young store clerk is shot to death.
The robber fires one round from a semi-automatic 9mm pistol.
The killers apparently don't care that security video will catch them in the act, and they make a crucial mistake that's caught on camera.
There's no perfect crime. And sure enough, that's when we got the lead that would end up solving the case.
Shortly before midnight on May 20th, 2015, 20-year-old Sean Smith arrived at a smoke shop called Smoke 911 in Woodstock, Georgia, an Atlanta suburb. He was there to see his friend Enrique de los Reyes, whose shift at the store was just about to end. 21-year-old Enrique was known to everyone as EJ.
Being an only child, his parents doted on him. EJ had taken a job at the Smoke 911 in Woodstock, pretty much his first adult job.
Sean often helped EJ close up the store, but this time, something seemed different.
They were going to hang out after work. When his friend Sean Smith came to the store, he saw a silver BMW, and in the driver's seat of the BMW was a black male wearing a red beanie and had a gray sweatshirt on.
Sean made eye contact with the driver and was a little unnerved just about the eye contact.
Sean mentioned the car to EJ, who had also seen it.
Sean asked him, why haven't you called the police? And EJ's response was, they haven't done anything wrong. Why am I going to call the police?
EJ and Sean proceeded to close up the store. Within a few minutes, two men burst inside.
They entered into the front door of the business, both brandishing firearms, placed both EJ and Mr. Smith on the ground. Mr. Smith was searched and subsequently moved to the bathroom area, while the other suspect went to the cash register, started taking money and merchandise.
While Sean was in the bathroom, he heard a single gunshot. After hearing a car drive away, he rushed out to find EJ covered in blood.
Hey, County 911, to emergency.
This is the Smoke 911 on Woodstock.
Okay.
My friend has just been shot. He's bleeding. It's in his right upper chest.
First responders arrived minutes later to find EJ fighting for his life.
He suffered a single gunshot wound to the chest. As he arrived at the hospital, he became unresponsive and they were unable to revive him.
Law enforcement got on the phone with EJ's mom, broke the news to her, and she was completely devastated, fell to the ground and sobbed along with EJ's dad.
A single 9mm shell casing was on a store counter. The silver BMW that had been in the parking lot was gone. A visibly shaken Sean Smith was exonerated by the surveillance video and was now turned to as an eyewitness to the crime. He described the attackers as black males in their early 20s.
Both of the suspects had their faces covered. One had a skull cap pulled over his face, had slits in where his eyes would be so he could see. The other individual had, his shirt kind of pulled up and his hand covering his face to disguise it. There's a struggle between EJ and the suspect, and you see the suspect pull the gun out and shoot EJ one time in the chest.
The smoke shop had no cameras outside the store, so there were no usable images of the BMW Sean saw earlier that night. Investigators were in a tough spot. Their evidence was thin, and their suspects gave every indication of being seasoned professionals.
It was very apparent that these guys had committed robberies before. This wasn't an amateur job at all.
E-cigarettes and, in some states, legalized marijuana have made smoke shops into lucrative business opportunities. They are largely cash businesses, and that makes them an inviting target for criminals, a fact known to E.J. Reyes.
There had been some other robberies in the area that his family knew about, and were concerned enough to talk to him about how to handle any robbery or anything that might happen there at the smoke shop.
The problem for investigators is that these crimes are mostly random. They have nothing to do with the people inside the store and everything to do with what's in the store.
Random crimes will always be the most difficult to investigate because there's no personal relationship between your victim and your suspect.
When it's random in nature, it is oftentimes hard because you're trying to get suspects in millions of people. Even with a surveillance camera, which we had here, that captured the entire crime, it's difficult. It's often like, trying to catch that one fish in a giant ocean.
Investigators pored over every second of surveillance video from the Reyes murder and noticed a mistake made by one of the suspects.
As suspect number 2 was moving merchandise around, he picked up a tote that he was sticking merchandise in. But before doing that, he had to remove the top, and the top was left behind on the scene.
What made this important was that suspect number 2, unlike suspect number 1, was not wearing gloves. Analysts seized the lid of this plastic container and made an unusual decision on how to treat it as evidence. They opted for a possible fingerprint instead of the touch DNA.
DNA takes time to process. It has to go to the crime lab.
The surveillance video allowed analysts to target the exact spot where suspect number 2 touched this item. If a print could be lifted, it would almost certainly be his.
So fingerprints, if you could get that immediately and get that information now, you'd rather have that than wait on DNA results.
Especially with the killer on the loose. But in a setback, the prints were only partial and not good enough to get a hit in AFIS, the National Fingerprint Database.
Which was kind of a downer. We were hoping that those prints off, the late impressions off that lid would provide identity of a suspect, but they did not.
Despite both suspects having taken considerable efforts to hide their identities, Sean Smith got a good look at one of them as he walked into the store. With the help of a forensic artist, a composite sketch was created. This and still frames from the surveillance video were released to the public. Tips poured in, and one looked promising.
We got an anonymous tip from a young lady who stated that she believed the person responsible for the robbery homicide in Woodstock was a Mr. Varner. She stated that he had had a history of drug use and violent crime, and that the day after our homicide occurred, she knew that Mr. Varner was in Canton, Georgia, attempting to sell a .40 caliber handgun, and seemed to be very nervous.
And Varner, who had 2 outstanding arrest warrants, had access to the same type of vehicle used in the Reyes murder.
She claimed that Prior to the robbery homicide, she had seen Mr. Varner in his girlfriend's vehicle, which she described to be a 4-door BMW that was silver or gray in color.
On Varner's Facebook page, detectives found photos of several people with known gang ties. One was wearing clothing similar to clothes worn by one of the murder suspects.
Some of the people that he was standing with were wearing a multicolored ball cap that was very similar to what the second suspect in our robbery homicide was wearing.
Varner, when brought in for questioning, claimed he had nothing to do with the murder and had an alibi to prove it.
Also, Mr. Varner was actually older than the two that were inside the store. So we were able to discount Mr. Varner as a suspect.
The investigation was back to square one. But then, another robbery at another smoke shop provided a possible avenue to solve the Reyes murder.
We firmly believe that the smoke shop robberies in Cobb and Cherokee County were related.
Four days before the smoke shop murder of E.J. Reyes, two smoke shops were also robbed in Kennesaw, a town just 10 miles away.
The surveillance video from the Kennesaw smoke shop robberies showed similar suspects acting in similar ways, forcibly taking over the store, coming in fast, taking items, and leaving fairly quickly.
There was another similarity. The vehicle used in the robberies was a silver BMW. A surveillance camera outside one of the stores captured high-quality images of the vehicle.
It was much more clear of an image of that BMW, but still did not read a license plate or be able to identify the occupants.
You could see the car really good. In fact, what you could see about it were the star-shaped wheels that did not appear to be factory wheels to the car.
This BMW with custom wheels quickly became the focus of the investigation. Detectives surmised the vehicle was likely stolen.
Often in commercial robberies and other robberies, a lot of people use stolen cars to commit those crimes. They can destroy those cars, they can burn them, they can abandon them. I requested a list of stolen silver BMWs from, I believe, 2003 to 2015 models in the Atlanta metro area.
The list included 135 vehicles, and there was no guarantee that the BMW sought by investigators was on it.
I always tell people this is the Georgia Bureau investigation, not the Georgia Bureau we know everything already. It felt like we were a long way from identifying a suspect.
In a major potential break, detectives now learned of a string of video game store robberies in the same area. The thieves in these crimes appeared to be the same people hitting local smoke shops.
It was discovered that GameStop video game stores were being robbed in a similar manner, with speed and violence, taking over the store, taking items from people's pockets, taking items from the store, and then fleeing.
The suspects bore the same physical description as those robbing area smoke shops. These crimes were almost certainly linked. Investigators now went to a robbery at a video game store that happened 2 days before the Reyes murder. In this crime, 3 suspects were involved. Surveillance video showed one of them was not wearing gloves.
You can see one of the offenders grabbing items, headphones, and smaller box items that are held behind the cash register. And in doing so, one of the items was touched and not taken. So that item stayed and remained on the shelf.
It was clear this thief had touched the item with his bare hand. Investigators now made the same decision they'd made earlier. Since speed was important, they went for the fingerprints instead of the DNA. The box was sent to the lab where it was processed for fingerprints using cyanoacrylate, what can be bought off the shelf as superglue.
We have a cyanoacrylate chamber or superglue chamber, an airtight tank that we process the evidence in. We place the item in that tank, heat that superglue, and then fill the tank up. And then after, say, 30 minutes, you should start to see if there are latent prints on the item that you're processing.
Heat causes the superglue to vaporize. The The microscopic particles are attracted to the sweat and oils excreted by fingers and left behind on the surface of the item. The particles then crystallize, leaving a white residue.
The superglue process basically hardens the fingerprint, so you're able to take multiple lifts of that latent print if it develops.
4 high-quality prints were lifted and put into the APHIS database. One matched back to a man named Nathaniel DeLay.
Mr. Nathaniel DeLay had minor criminal history, no felonies, never been to prison, nothing like an armed robbery before.
DeLay flatly denied involvement in any of the robberies or the Reyes murder.
I was at the house watching the game Monday, smoking marijuana with my girl. That's the truth. I believe it.
Nathaniel DeLay's telling us that it had been years since he's been in Cobb County. That's actually a good thing for investigators, because if he would have said that he had been to GameStop and he had been there just a day before, it kind of eliminates and cuts our legs out of finding that fingerprint on that box and kind of gives him an out.
Nathaniel DeLay had no explanation for why his prints were at the scene of one of the robberies. But what investigators were really after was who killed E.J. Reyes. That murder and this robbery appeared to be directly connected, and Nathaniel DeLay seemed to know a lot more about both crimes than he was letting on.
If I had a nickel for every time somebody told me a lie, I wouldn't have to be a cop.
Nathaniel, my name's Ryan Hilton. I'm with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. All right, man? How you doing?
From the start, detectives attempting to solve the murder of E.J. Reyes were on the lookout for a silver BMW with custom wheels that was seen outside the smoke shop where E.J. was killed. They soon learned that 9 days before the murder, a BMW fitting that description had been carjacked in Atlanta.
The victim had told law enforcement that there were 2 suspects that had put a gun to him and robbed him, carjacked him.
The carjacked victim, Paul Jordan, was shown the composite drawing and video images from the Reyes murder, but could not make an identification. Then something unexpected happened, which led investigators straight back to their only suspect, Nathaniel DeLay.
Nathaniel DeLay has a unique look. He has the word success tattooed across his forehead. I just swiped my phone and I came to the driver's license photo of Nathaniel DeLay. Mr. Jordan stopped and said, "That is 100% the person who took my car."
What's your reaction to that?
Hot damn.
The problem was that Nathaniel DeLay did not look at all like the suspects in the murder of E.J. Reyes. And DeLay was clear. He wasn't there, but knew a lot about the murder.
I didn't give you a rumor that I heard they killed somebody. Let's talk about that. No, this is what you want to know for real, for real. For real, for real. Yeah, right. That's why we're here. Now, look.
DeLay told detectives that a man named Justin White called him the day after the Reyes murder and was extremely nervous.
He said, "Man, I know how to get rid of this goddamn gun, man. Don't get hot." He said, this exact word, "gonna get hot." I was like, "What's going on, bro?" He was like, "Man, I had to do it. I had to do it." Like, what you talking about?
He told DeLay specifically to Google that incident, to look up that incident in the news.
I called him back and I was like, "Dude, you shot the man? You killed the man?" He was like, "I had no choice." Like, "Dude, you need to go pray." And that's how I found out.
Nathaniel DeLay told police that the other person in this robbery murder was a man named Dominic Stevens.
Dominic Stevens had previously been in prison, but Justin White had nothing but traffic offenses prior to this. So no indication that he was a violent criminal prior to these incidences.
Multiple items from the robberies were found in their homes.
The evidence located at the scene was huge. It was a huge factor in proving that Justin White and Dominic Stevens were responsible for the death of E.J.
Dominic Stevens maintained his innocence, but when faced with the evidence, Justin White came clean about what happened the night E.J. Reyes was shot to death. His story was that he never intended to harm anyone. He just reacted when EJ fought back during the robbery.
We just went in there, you know. I told him, I was like, I'm not gonna take your phones or your wallets. You know, I'm gonna put it by the door. I'm saying, just please cooperate. When I turned around and I got punched, I didn't even know I shot. You know, I didn't even know.
None of the blame for this can be placed on EJ. None of it. Justin White knew what he was doing when he got into it. The fact that EJ fought back, however tragic and noble, not his fault he got shot, never will be. That rests on Justin White.
Nathaniel DeLay, who was not present at the murder, pleaded guilty to armed robbery and got 5 years. Justin White and Dominique Stevens pleaded guilty to a racketeering charge that included all the robberies and the murder of E.J. Reyes. Dominique Stevens got life in prison plus 5 years. Justin White, the shooter, got consecutive life sentences.
The way I look at armed robberies is it is just 1 second away from being a homicide case. Anytime you go into a place brandishing a firearm, you're showing that you are willing and able to use that firearm.
Investigators readily admit that if not for the discovery of a single fingerprint inadvertently deposited during a well-planned but still chaotic robbery, the murder of E.J. Reyes might never have been solved.
The fingerprint was really the linchpin in this case. Without that fingerprint, we would have never been able to identify anybody that was involved.
In this case, it reminded me of the basics. The best professionals in whatever field it is do the absolute best at the basics. Process the crime scene, look at the evidence, review surveillance video, and have good evidence collection procedures. If you can do that, you can solve cases.
Up next, this investigation is off to a shaky start.
This is a whole different type of autopsy because of the condition of his body.
A lot of valuable time and clues have been lost.
As time goes on, you can lose DNA evidence, you can lose witnesses.
Detectives fear a killer won't be caught until his own words seal his fate.
Does bleach kill skin cells?
In 26 years, I've never had the killer's voice basically admitting what he did right there on audio.
Founded in 1642, Warwick, Rhode Island is one of the oldest cities in America, a place long defined by its proximity to the Atlantic Ocean.
We have so much coastline that water life is inherent to everybody who lives here. I know so many people that have a boat. So obviously in the summer, that's when people are out on their boats and they're parked at marinas, dinghies, all sorts of, apparatus related to the boats.
Countless boats and lives have been lost to the sea over the decades, many falling victim to volatile weather.
From the West Bay Mobile Newsroom, Eyewitness News moves to West Warwick, where we're getting a great look of the storm that we've never seen before.
On August 4th, 2015, a weather phenomenon known as a macroburst devastated the area.
This was an unusual event. My guess is they were in the range of 90 to 120 mile an hour winds. The only way I can think of describing it, sort of a mini tornado.
A storm with this kind of power wreaked havoc on many boats along the coast.
It was chaotic. The microburst had everything out of sorts. It wasn't uncommon for boats to be pulled off their mooring or taken off their anchor.
So when, in the aftermath of the storm, the local harbor master saw a 26-foot sailboat called the Star Capella floating off the shore, he didn't think much of it.
The boat was dragging anchor. Of course, he called out before he boarded the boat. Nobody answered. So he took the boat put it onto one of the city moorings. Before he did that, he checked the boat, looked in, saw a lot of debris, cushions, no signs of anybody in the boat.
The harbor master towed the boat to a mooring for safekeeping. No one claimed it. When he came back 11 days later, he noticed something unusual.
There was a very foul odor coming from the boat, so he boarded it to see if he can find out where that smell was coming from.
The smell was coming from a badly decomposed human body, covered up with a jumble of material from inside the boat. The body wasn't found during the initial search because the harbor master hadn't expected to find anyone on board, and also because the body was covered with debris.
We could not tell if the body was a male or female, age, race. The prior 2 weeks to that point had been in the mid-80s to lower 90s, so the weather and the conditions did not help in our investigation.
The body was so decomposed, detectives couldn't even tell how or when the victim died.
Was the death something that was completely accidental, or was this the result of some other act, possibly even a homicide?
The medical examiner was presented with a body nearly devoid of identifying features.
Our number one challenge in this case is I don't know who this is. After we undressed the body, we could tell it had male features, and that's basically all we can say. We don't know the age, we don't know the race, and obviously fingerprints are no longer there. They had decomposed away, they melted away.
A full autopsy showed the victim had broken ribs. Despite the decomposition, bruising was found deep in the victim's skull. But these findings didn't necessarily indicate foul play. After all, the macroburst storm was unusually powerful.
Could it have been that the boat was knocked around so much that the person could have slipped and fallen, hit their head, and then things landed on them? Was he murdered and then covered? Or was it just an accident in really bad weather?
A key finding put the accident theory to rest. The victim's hyoid bone, a floating bone located in the neck, was broken.
That would not have happened accidentally. It was a true fracture. This one little bone will tell me that there was significant pressure applied to the neck and he was basically strangled.
Doctors and detectives now knew their victim had been murdered. The problem was, days had passed and they still had no idea who he was. About the only thing detectives knew about their murder victim was that he was a male and not young. They combed area missing persons records and found no one who fit this admittedly broad description. Even worse, a lot of time had passed since the murder, a significant setback for any investigation.
They knew they had already been at least 10 days removed from when this murder may have occurred, so they knew the clock was ticking.
So there was a lot of catch-up to do in order to find out some of these things, to figure out exactly what it is that happened.
The boat belonged to a 70-year-old man named Fernando Silva. Police contacted his brother, who hadn't heard from him for days, but was able to provide valuable information.
We were able to actually pinpoint a date and a time that his boat was docked at a marina, and we began our investigation at that location.
Now that detectives knew where the boat was docked before the macroburst storm, they had a starting point. They questioned the man who worked security at that marina.
He was able to confirm that the boat in question was entered several times by two young males at very odd hours, being very early in the morning. And he stated that he questioned them on about 3 different occasions.
These two men, the security man didn't know them, said they were helping a man who identified himself as Freddie install a new engine. They came back repeatedly in the days before the macroburst storm to continue their work.
They came back with what appeared to be a new motor, but they weren't too mechanically savvy and were unable to get the boat started.
Detectives needed to identify these two men. But first, they had to see if the dead man in the morgue was Fernando Silva. Many people recognized the name. They knew a Navy veteran nicknamed Captain Freddy, who was a regular on the docks.
Freddy, where you headed?
Captain Freddy was sort of a maritime vagabond, I would say. He had no experience with boats, fell in love with boats, and wasn't really sure what to do with them, other than to be on them. He lived on his boat.
Freddy chronicled his feelings in a book he was writing called The Blessed Voyage. He was such a character that even local filmmakers got him to tell his story.
I bought it because it was actually bigger than the car. The car was falling apart, but I just abandoned it in the parking lot, and I walked all the way back to the boat, and that was the end of that.
Dental records were found and matched dental x-rays from the victim. A DNA comparison with a known relative confirmed his identity.
It was Mr. Fernando Silva, sometimes called Captain Freddy, to his friends at the marina. We have a definite forensic method for identifying him.
Now that police knew who Captain Freddy was, they backtracked him in the days leading to the macroburst storm that sent his boat out to sea. 4 nights before that storm, Captain Freddy won several $100s playing Keno, a legal computer gambling game found all over the region.
He was known as being very lucky, and in the establishments that he frequented, they all knew him as playing that very often.
Shortly before the storm, Captain Freddy hit it big playing Keno, and he let a lot of people know it.
He didn't have very much money, so when he struck it, in his mind, he hit the jackpot. This was a big win for him, and he was excited about it.
But when Captain Freddy was found dead, that money was gone. It wasn't in his boat or with his body. The captain didn't have much, but it appeared what little he had may have led to his murder.
A couple people saw that he won, and ultimately, their knowledge of him winning that money might have led to the crime.
After Captain Freddy Silva's boat was found at sea during a severe summer storm, it was towed back to a local marina. Detectives traced the boat back to where it was originally docked and discovered that 2 unknown men had spent a lot of time on the captain's boat in the days after he went missing. In a crucial break for investigators, these men were recorded by surveillance cameras.
I was going through basically 2 weeks of video, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which was about 20,000 video files. You really have to look at everything because we don't know what happened, how it happened, and not necessarily these 2 were necessarily the ones involved.
People at the marina told detectives that one of these men might be Troy Gunderway, a local man, a petty criminal, almost instantly recognizable because of the large eye tattooed on his skull.
Troy Gunderway was a resident of Warwick who had been in and out of prison. He had worked odds and end jobs when he wasn't incarcerated.
The further investigation learned that Troy Gunderway had known Fernando Silva prior to the murder, and that he in fact had assisted Fernando in attempting to get a motor for that boat on a previous date.
Detectives asked Troy Gunderway about the other man who was seen working with him on Captain Freddy's boat.
Mr. Gunderway said that he was with a friend that he called Big Red, and believes his real name was Rich.
After a little digging, detectives came up with a name, Richard Baribolt.
Richard Baribolt had several run-ins with the police. He had served approximately a quarter of his life behind bars. Most of it was drug-related, alcohol-related, and domestic abuse-related.
A further background check showed Baribolt had a suspended driver's license, and he was driving a pickup truck that might or might not be the one in this surveillance video shot near the marina where the captain docked his boat.
On the night that we believe Captain Freddy was killed, a maroon pickup truck with the same sticker pattern as found on Mr. Baribolt's pickup truck left the marina at pretty much the time that we thought the incident had occurred.
Now that detectives knew who Baribolt was, they simply waited until he got behind the wheel and pulled him over.
At which point he was arrested for operating on a suspended license and operating a motor vehicle without registration.
In one of Barabolt's pockets, they found a knife with a blade over 3 inches, in itself a violation of state law. Even worse for Barabolt, the knife appeared to have blood on it.
I asked Mr. Barabolt if there would be any reason for blood to be on the knife. He stated the only reasons would be his own blood, which he might have cut himself, or the blood of fish when he has gone fishing.
The knife was sent out for testing. Barabolt admitted to police that he saw Freddy the night he died, but said Troy Gundaway had murdered the captain, not him.
You know what this comes down to at this point is you're telling us, listen, I was there. He did all the I don't know why he was doing it. I tried to get him to stop it.
Because he wanted money.
Yeah, because he wanted money. The only discrepancy between your stories at this point, pretty much, is who the aggressor was.
It was him. I'm telling you right now, it was him.
I'm just telling you, that's the only discrepancy at this point. Who was the aggressor?
Him.
At this point.
But what Barabolt didn't know was that investigators had a surprise piece of evidence, his own voice, trying to get information on how to cover up a murder.
So in the search warrant, when they search with Google through a voice search on the phone, it actually records your voice in your exact words.
Where would Warwick Harbor Master take a towed boat?
Troy Gundaway told police he and Richard Barabolt knew Captain Freddy was flush with cash after his wins at Keno, and their plan was to steal that money.
So they decided that due to his age and the fact that he was on a boat and there probably wouldn't be anybody else around, they thought he'd be an easy target to rob.
Barabolt and Gundaway pointed fingers at each other as Captain Freddy's killer. Detectives thought both men were involved, but they needed evidence to prove it. So they confiscated and examined both men's cell phones.
Typically when we get a phone, we go through an extraction process where we hook the phone up to a forensic computer and we extract the information from the hard drive of that phone. That's going to include something as simple as user settings to things like location history, telephone calls, chats, apps that you've used. There's a myriad of information that you can get from that.
In fact, a lot of information vital to any murder investigation. Where the suspect was, what time he was there, who he was talking to, can be gleaned from a forensic examination of a cell phone. And Barabolt's phone was a potential gold mine of evidence.
We were able to determine the location of the cell phone prior to the murder, the night of the murder, during the murder, and after the murder. And therefore we can link the cell phone location with Mr. Barabolt.
The examination showed both suspects' phones were on Captain Freddy's boat early on the morning of August 1st, just hours after the captain won big playing Keno. And those phones were also at the boat many times in the days that followed. But some questions remained.
Who's holding the phone? Who's making the call? A lot of that stuff, you could come up with a defense. You could come up with an excuse or an alibi.
A combination of evidence solved that problem. The locations provided by both suspects' phones matched up to the second, with surveillance images of 2 previously unknown men getting on and off Captain Freddy's boat.
Over the course of 4 days, I saw them come and go from the boat a minimum of 10 times.
Even though Richard Barabolt maintained his innocence, the most damning clue against him came straight from his own mouth, through a voice search he did on his Google search engine.
Between August 1st and August 4th, we were able to find from Google several audio recordings in Mr. Barabolt's voice.
Does bleach kill everything, including skin cells?
That was very telling due to the fact that we found a gallon full of bleach where Mr. Silva was located. The evidence was overwhelming.
Killy Ave, Warwick.
There were many questions which he was asking Google to see if the answers would be right there for him.
Boat motor mechanic in Warwick, Rhode Island.
By now, the results from the forensic examination of Barabolt's knife had come in and confirmed what investigators already suspected. The blood was Captain Freddy's.
There's really no other reason for his blood to be on that knife except that he was there at the time when Mr. Silver was murdered.
Prosecutors believe Gundaway and Baribolt knew Captain Freddy had won a couple $100 playing Keno. They snuck onto the captain's boat, expecting to overpower him and steal his money. On board, Baribolt held Captain Freddy at knife point, drawing the blood that remained on the weapon even weeks after the attack. When Freddy fought back, he was beaten, strangled, and left for dead. For the next 4 days, Baribolt and Gundaway tried to clean up the scene, doing Google searches on Baribolt's phone to see how they could best do the job. At every moment in the attempted cover-up, their phones and surveillance video documented their locations. In an attempt to hide the evidence, they drove Captain Freddy's boat out to sea and abandoned it, hoping this floating crime scene would never be found. But the macroburst storm, just days after the murder, did something they hadn't counted on. It caused the boat to float back towards the shoreline, where it was later found by the harbor master. Ultimately, Captain Freddy's decomposing body exposed the crime, tied Baribolt and Gundaway to his boat, to his corpse, and to his murder. But it was Baribolt's own voice, looking for information on how to conceal the crime, that sealed his fate.
What towns in Rhode Island have garbage days, garbage pickup on Friday morning?
The Google search has a date, a timestamp, and a GPS coordinate location of that exact search. There was no denying it was his voice asking that question at that specific time in that specific location.
In 2017, Troy Gundaway pled guilty to second-degree murder and got 55 years in prison. Richard Big Red Baribolt, who elected, despite the evidence against him, to go to trial, got life plus 10 years, all for a murder that came down to just a few $100s.
Captain Freddy had a large and loving family, and they're very supportive of him and everything that he did. And it was very emotional. Those wounds are very much real and very much still fresh. And to hear the evidence and what happened that night, and how these people just went on with their regular lives and didn't really give it much thought after they got rid of the boat, it's tough.
It's always good to catch the bad guy, but in this particular case, that satisfaction is multiplied when you can go to the family and say, hey, listen, unfortunate circumstances, but we were able to find the person responsible and they're going to pay for what they did.
The electronic evidence that we were able to get definitely sealed the deal with the jury's eyes. A lot of juries want the CSI fingerprints. They want that undeniable evidence. And just happened we were able to get that.